Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for What is Casco Bay Telling Us, a Casco Bay Matters event. Hi, I'm Will Everett. I'm the Interim Director at Friends of Casco Bay. Our mission is to improve and protect the environmental health of Casco Bay, and we appreciate each and every one of you being here today. Friends of Casco Bay protects the environmental health of Casco Bay through collecting data, through science, collecting data on the health of the bay, through using those data in our advocacy work to reduce pollution and help our communities adapt to climate changes and changes we're seeing, and through involving the community in our work. This event is going to cover all three of those strategies and through the lens of what is Casco Bay telling us? For 29 years now, Friends of Casco Bay has been collecting data all around the bay from our Baykeeper boat and by taking the docks and piers all around the bay from Cape Elizabeth to Phippsburg. And we're listening to the bay. The data we collect become part of the state's water quality database. It's used by scientists and academics and regulators. The data is even sent to Congress every few years as part of the Clean Water Act reporting that the state does. Most importantly, our data is used by Casco Baykeeper Ivy Frignoca in order to do the advocacy work we do to reduce pollution. Today, you're going to spend some time with two people at the heart of our work, Ivy, who I just mentioned, and staff scientist Mike Doan. And it's our hope that together, all of us will be learning what Casco Bay is telling us through listening to Mike and Ivy and through your questions. So be sure to insert them in the chat. Staff scientist Mike Doan has been working with us for over a quarter of a century. Mike started as an intern with us. He got hired on staff after graduating from UMaine and hasn't looked back. He designed our Cages of Science, the continuous monitoring stations we have across the bay that are collecting data every hour on how the bay may be impacted by climate change. So you'll hear from him, and Ivy Frignoca is our lead advocate. As Casco Baykeeper, she uses her background in environmental law to promote policies and practices to improve the health of the bay. She's the eyes, ears, and voice of Casco Bay, or sometimes, as she describes herself, the Lorax of the sea. So now I'd like to invite Mike and Ivy out onto the Zoom screen. As they come on, hey Mike, hey Ivy. As they come on, I'm going to disappear and keep track of your questions. Towards the end of the event, I'm going to come back on stage and ask Mike and Ivy your questions. So as they talk, be sure to put them in the chat. All right. Thanks, Will. Mike. Thanks, Ivy.
Thank you, Will. And thank you all for joining us today. Just briefly, for those of you who are very new to us, Friends of Casco Bay is a marine stewardship organization. We do a lot of outreach and education and advocacy, which Ivy will talk to us about soon. But we base all of that on science, on good science. And today I want to talk about how we collect that data, what we're seeing in that data this year, and along with Ivy, how we're using that data. And again, very briefly, before we get to the heart of this talk, we collect data through two different water quality monitoring programs primarily. One of those programs is our seasonal water quality monitoring program. And this is what we've been doing for almost 30 years now. I can't believe it's been 29 years. We go out to 22 sites spread across the bay. We go out every 3 weeks to collect data. And we do that, as you might expect, seasonally, spring, summer, and fall. And you'll be hearing and seeing a lot more about that program in just a minute. The other program is newer to us, our continuous monitoring station program. We have 3 stations now. And thanks to all of you who supported our capital campaign to get there, and thanks to the Estuary Partnership, the Casco Estuary Partnership as well. We have 3 stations collecting data hourly, year-round, again, across the bay. So it's very exciting to have all of that data at our fingertips. But let's turn things over very quickly to Ivy to let us know about how we use that data.
I'm going to keep my comments here brief because we're very excited to sort of take you in the field with us and talk about the summer. I've been looking at what you've all been putting in the chat in response to the question Will asked, and you're hitting on exactly where our advocacy is going. So we do use the data we're collecting to have the bay talk to us and tell us what's happening in the bay. And we know things are changing quickly, and they know that they continue to change. So what we're learning in one year may not be what happens in the next year. So oftentimes we're looking at trends, and then we're trying to make the best policy decisions and take the best actions that will help protect the bay and make it resilient for the future. So in thinking about what y'all put in chat, I'm going to summarize and say we totally agree with you all that the climate change, all the indicators of climate change, whether it's the warmer temperatures you're seeing, the really weird swings in weather patterns, the rise in invasive species, many of the things that you're mentioning are the things that concern us, and we're working on to respond to the impacts of climate change. The second thing, that big theme that emerged from your comments that is also of concern to us and we're grappling with, so difficult to tackle, is the many pressures on the bay and the multiple uses of the bay. You know, as we turn to it more for growing our food, with the changes in the natural species that can live here or are migrating out of the area or can no longer live here due to temperature changes, to all the different bay users and how we ensure that we protect the bay for balanced uses by everyone. What we really want to do is we miss all of you. And Mike and I were thinking, how do we spend time with all of you? So we decided we would do a video of us in the field together and kind of take you with us virtually. So Sarah, would you please cue up the video, and then Mike and I will bring you out in the field with us. Mike, did I forget anything, or is there anything you want to add while Sarah's getting the video on?
No, that was great. I think what we want to share with you now is just a look at how we collect that data, as Ivy mentioned, and so come along with us as we get out into the bay and conduct some of our seasonal monitoring work.
And I saw somebody asked when we do it. We're out there from April through October, pretty much.
Yep.
Oh, the video disappeared. Sarah, is that?
Al, I just want to make sure that everyone can see you all as we're doing this. So give me just a moment.
Sure. What we're going to see is a video of Ivy and I conducting the water quality monitoring work, a real hands-on thing, as we go out together into the bay. So let's roll that, and we'll take you along with us. So again, what we're looking at is our seasonal sampling, kind of a day in the life. And we get out to those 22 sites across the bay every few weeks. And we do that both by boat, as you see here, and also by land in our truck, as you see here. Some sites are just easier to get to in the truck. So
And
here we are. Oh, go ahead, Ivy.
yeah, I was just going to say, we love doing this work together because it gets us out to so many locations around the bay, and it's just so beautiful. And we get to not only talk with each other, but to so many people that we see out and about the bay, working on the bay or living there. And before I turn it back over, like, this is our groovy theme music. We don't usually have this behind us in the bay, but we kind of like it. Mike, you want to explain what we're doing here?
Sure. It's a very low tide, and this site is important to us because it's not only a seasonal site, but it's also one of our continuous monitoring sites. And you can see the cage there. I always check the cage at this site, but we work side by side collecting data, and we'll go over each component of how we collect data. First is the data sonde. This is a multi-parameter instrument.
I just want y'all to notice how happy Mike is. He loves this new equipment. This is part of the fund that helped us increase and expand our monitoring. Go ahead, Mike.
Sure, the very latest from the company, a lot higher data quality with this instrument. But with the push of a button, as you can see, we can collect data on a number of measurements for the health of the bay, including temperature and the acidity and the amount of oxygen in the bay, the chlorophyll, turbidity, salinity, all important measures of the water quality of the bay.
And while Mike is doing that, I'm collecting samples of nitrogen. And when we have too much nitrogen in the bay, it causes impacts like fertilizing large mats of algae. And these are known as nuisance algal mats, and our water reporters help document this. So I collect 2 samples. One is total nitrogen, or all the nitrogen that is in the water. And then the other is the inorganic nitrogen. And we use a protocol that is approved to assure that our data is of good quality. And so that involves 3 rinses at every step along the way. You won't see that all in the video, but trust me, it's being done. The first sample that I collect is for total nitrogen. Like I said, this is all the forms of nitrogen that are in the water, whether they're inorganic or organic, which means from living matter. And to ensure that these samples are high quality, once we collect these, we put them in a cooler on ice and bring them back to our office when we're done, freeze them, and then Mike has a special process for sending them off to a lab for analysis. Now I'm looking at dissolved inorganic nitrogen, so I'm going to have to filter the organics out of the water, and this is the fun part of my job, is I get to squirt water out. I try not to shoot it at Mike. Then I put a filter on the end of this syringe, and that is what gets all the organics out of the sample. And the reason we do this is that this dissolved inorganic nitrogen is the form that's most readily usable to fertilize phytoplankton blooms. And so we want to know that in addition to the total nitrogen. So there's the 2 samples. And as you just saw, Mike and I talk all the time when we're in the field. Back to you, Mike.
Sure. Another way we assess the health of the water of Casco Bay is by using a Secchi disc. You may not know that this was invented over 150 years ago by Angelo Secchi, but it's a very consistent way of measuring water clarity. And we simply lower this disc into the water, and we see how deep into the water it still remains visible. And by doing that, we can know a little more about how much phytoplankton may be in the water, how much turbidity might be in the water, but it's an old tried and true method that we still use today.
And one of the factors that influences what we're seeing in the bay are the weather conditions that day, or even the time of day. Like, for example, later in the day, there's going to be more photosynthesis, and we might see higher dissolved oxygen levels as a result. So here's our data sheet that we bring with us every time we're in the field. We collect information on wind, speed, and direction. Mike uses this tool. I use my hair, see how much it blows back, and often the 2 measurements match up very well. So we record all of this data because it helps us sort of tease out what is influencing what we're measuring with the sonde and the Secchi disc. And after we collect this data, we go back to the truck if we're by truck and move on to the next site. So if you want to learn more, go into this in detail. This data is on our webpage, but Mike is going to give you an overview now of what we saw in the data this year.
I am. And I just want to say that the video seemed a bit chunky there, and I wonder if it's some of the weather having some issues with the internet, but hopefully that video will be available on our website soon so you can watch it on your own. It is really well done and a lot of fun to put together. What I want to do now is to talk about what we're seeing in this data, and I am going to use our website to do so. So bear with me. I want to share this data through our website to encourage you to go to our website often. We do upload all of the data, both through that seasonal program that you just saw and from our continuous stations, as often as we can. As often as we get new data, we're putting it on our website. So I thought this would be a great way to kind of share with you what I'm seeing. The 4 things I want to share with you, the 4 observations in our data, just in case the storm does knock out internet and we can't get to the end. My conclusions are that we have much clearer water this past summer, and I'm going to talk with you about that through our seasonal portal here. We also had warmer waters, saltier waters, and we're seeing, I think, the effects of more nutrient enrichment in Portland Harbor, and we'll talk about all those things through our continuous data. But to start, from our website, which is what you're looking at here, our homepage, if you click on the Our Work tab and then down to the Science section, you will come to this map first, and just to orient yourself to Casco Bay and where we collect data, All of the blue dots are seasonal monitoring sites. This is where we just did the work that you saw. Again, spread around Casco Bay with some concentrations in areas we're a little more worried about. The yellow stars are the locations of our continuous monitoring stations. And this site way over here in the far right, the lower New Meadows, is where you were with us looking at that continuous station as well as seeing the seasonal work. But what I want to get to is scrolling down a little more, you'll come to tabs for both our continuous data and for our seasonal data. And I want to start with the seasonal tab and bring you to another map very quickly. This is an interactive map of our seasonal water quality data. So you can go in and click on any of these sites and it'll bring up the most recent data. And picking one at random, or in Bailey's Yacht Club, you'll see something like this. The most recent data is in the middle for each of these parameters. And what I want to talk about here is water clarity. So I'm going to scroll over to Secchi disk depth. And again, as you saw in that video, Secchi disk depth refers to the distance we can see through the water column. So that the higher the number, the deeper we can see, the clearer the water. And this monitoring season, we had much clearer water on average than we've had previously. All the sites had a higher average for Secchi depth than in previous years. So clearer water. But just to kind of show off the website, what you can do here with the interactive site, you can see we had a 3.6 meter deep Secchi depth. The seasonal range was 2.1 to 4.0. And if you click on that, you can actually see the data from every site, from every day, I'm sorry, that we were out there. So I encourage you again, we're done seasonal work for the year, of course, but we'll keep track here as often as we go out and follow along. But clearer water this year for sure. And to get, hold on one second. If you click back from seasonal, you get to our continuous data. And if you scroll down, you see a quick illustration, quick photo of the site, the station itself. But what I want to get to is this location. You can click on any one of these, Yarmouth, Harpswell, Portland Harbor sites, and look at all of our continuous data. And that's where I want to go next. We've talked about seasonal data and clearer water. But now I want to go to our Yarmouth continuous data and talk to you about the next two observations I've made, temperature and salinity. We're looking at Yarmouth data because that's the station we've had in the water the longest. And clicking on temperature, you'll see this. This is a graph of our daily averages, again, of temperature. Temperature in Celsius on the left, Fahrenheit on the right, depending on how you think about temperature. But we're looking at a graph of the daily averages for temperature over time. So January to the left through December on the right. Each colored line represents a different year. And what I want to focus on right here is the darker, thicker purple line. That's data from this year. And you can see, looking back here in January, we had a much, much warmer winter. And much of the data, much of the temperature data was above what we'd normally see, including right now. We're still well above what we would normally see over the past 5 or 6 years for water temperature. So we continue to be very warm in Casco Bay. But again, this data will be updated as we move forward every few weeks, so check in often. So warmer waters in Casco Bay.
Mike, one of the things that really strikes me about that is that even in July, when we had all that repeated rain, it didn't really drop the temperature down a whole lot. Like it leveled it for a little while, but then it seemed like I remember being surprised when we were out there to see that it didn't really have that big of an influence.
Right. Yes, exactly. And we'll see that again here in salinity. We're looking at the same kind of graph. All these graphs will be the same, daily averages plotted over the course of a year, January through December, each colored line representing a different year. Again, dark purple, the thicker line here, and this is salinity now, so how the saltiness of the bay. And you can see that thicker purple line lies above the other lines, showing that our data is saying that the water was saltier. We had higher salinities this year, even with those big rains in July. And it seems like when we compare this salinity data to rainfall, the rainfall just doesn't have that big an effect. What's more notable is when we compare this salinity data to river flow. When we have large river flows, we seem to have lower salinities. That has a bigger impact on the bay. And it's most notable, jumping back a couple of years here in 2019, this big drop in salinity happened when we had a huge river flow event, a big spring melt. So it certainly seems, at least through these observations, that bigger snowfalls over the winter lead to bigger snow melts in the spring, leads to lower salinity. So without much snow this past winter, we had higher salinities this year. So that was my third note observation, higher salinities, we've had higher temperatures, we've had clearer water. And finally, just because I'm really, really excited about having 3 continuous stations up and running all at the same time, that's my big takeaway this year. I want to scroll down the continuous page to the comparison section. And here we compare data from all 3 of our continuous monitoring stations. And the last observation I want to leave you with is that Portland Harbor seems to have more evidence of nutrient enrichment than our other 2 stations. And we use things like dissolved oxygen and pH to see how eutrophic or how much nutrient pollution a station might have. So I'll go first to dissolved oxygen. And while we're still looking at daily averages of the data here, and we're still looking at the year from January through December, now the colored lines represent each different station. Light green for the Yarmouth station, light blue for the Harpswell station over in New Meadows in the east, and then dark blue for Portland Harbor here in the west. And as you can see, we have lower dissolved oxygen. That dark blue line is lower than the other 2 lines. So lower dissolved oxygen in Portland Harbor, suggesting more nutrient enrichment, more nutrient pollution there. Another way we look at this, this is through pH. pH is a measure of the acidity of the water. Same kind of graph, daily averages over time, over the year. The dark blue of Portland Harbor falls out below the other 2 lines. The lower the pH, the more acidic the water. Again, so Portland Harbor seems to be a little more acidic than the other 2 sites. Again, evidence of being a little more nutrient enriched. So those are my 4 observations, my 4 big takeaways. Clearer water, warmer water, saltier water, and then this ability to compare between stations on an hourly basis, and seeing that Portland Harbor, kind of as expected, shows signs of being a little more nutrient rich. So that's probably enough from me. Abby, if you want to talk about how we're using a lot of this data.
Sure. So part of what we're doing when we're in the field, as we were mentioning during the video, is that we're also talking about what we're observing and making comparisons year to year and event to event, because we're out there, as we were saying, like every 3 weeks from April through October. And this year was very striking in that the water clarity remained very high all year. And and also when I was filtering the dissolved inorganic nitrogen samples, it was very easy to filter them. There wasn't like a lot of organics or suspended solids in the water. Like sometimes after a major rain event, the Royal River is a prime example. When there's a lot of the clay-based water coming out, I might go through 2 or 3 filters just to get one water sample by the time I get all the clays and other organics out. And or sediment and the organics out. And so that was really distinct, that we had very high water clarity and what appeared to be low productivity. And some of the observations we saw is that both, well, we were in the field and our water reporter network was in the field. We recorded less nuisance algal blooms, those green mats that you saw in our slideshow around the bay. And they often appeared later and were of less duration than we've seen in past years. The exception being Portland Harbor. The locations where we see those blooms remained consistent this year and persistent this year. And you know, may have been more in past years, but those were some of the blooms that remained consistent. And so that corresponds to what Mike was saying about that's an area that is showing signs of nutrient enrichment or nutrient impairment or excess nutrient loading. And both Mike and I are engaged in a process that the Department of Environmental Protection is working on to sort of set the limits for how much nitrogen the bay can absorb before you begin to see those negative impacts. So it's called setting a threshold. And we can talk more about that during the questions and answers, but it's to determine what are the levels above which you're going to start to see those negative impacts. And then once that level is set, then you can begin to make decisions, or the state can begin to make decisions to set limits in Clean Water Act permits or work on solutions to reducing nitrogen pollution from stormwater. And we're also engaged in that through the municipal separate stormwater permit. It's known as an MS4 permit. I won't go into all the details, except to say that in the new permit, which will go into effect in July 2022, there is a provision that encourages municipalities to adopt a fertilizer ordinance as a way to restore urban impaired streams, the exact ones that flow into Casco Bay, including those exact ones that flow into Casco Bay and are delivering excess nitrogen loads. And we're also working with municipalities and hopefully the state to revise how our how stormwater is treated and addressed from development and redevelopment. On that clarity aspect, this year was noteworthy too. And I know we have, I saw from the list of people participating, we have some people on who are oyster farmers. I saw no closures for harmful algal blooms this summer on Casco Bay, which like, wow, that doesn't happen. And I don't know why. I don't know if anyone knows why. I just checked in with the Department of Marine Resources again, and they were able to affirm that, you know, that they haven't had to shut down the aquaculture this summer, but they also don't know why we saw such low productivity. The other thing we saw a lot, and also worked with DEP at Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Marine Resources on, was eelgrass. Eelgrass is really important. Our water reporters help us track it. It's a type of seagrass that grows in lower intertidal and shallow subtidal waters. It's a really critical habitat, and it's very sensitive to changes. Like it needs clear water without too much nitrogen to be healthy. And so it's a great indicator of climate change, and it's a great indicator of too much nitrogen entering the bay by tracking its health. What our water reporters observed this summer, and we observed, is that a whole lot of eelgrass was just cut off and drifted up along the shore of Casco Bay. And this was really true in Brunswick and Freeport area, but Mike and I saw it as far down as Falmouth Town Landing. And in looking through the drifts of eelgrass, we did see evidence of green crabs shredding eelgrass roots as they were feeding in there. I know some people have reported waterfowl they saw ripping up eelgrass as they were feeding in the shallows. There was some question about whether the pogie fishermen, as the eelgrass beds have rebounded, their seining nets may have had an impact. The Department of Marine Resources looked into that, does not believe that there's a connection there. So we still don't completely understand why we saw so much eelgrass washed ashore, but that was a major observation from this year, and it's a critical habitat that we're very concerned about and want to help conserve for the health of the bay. And finally, on a personal note, that saltiness that Mike was mentioning, the bay being extra salty this year. I don't know if anybody else noticed this, but oh my goodness, the Casco Bay oysters and soft shell clams this summer were superb. And I just so enjoyed eating them. So, so that was one personal note and benefit of the extra saltiness this season. I think, you know, what's that?
That counts as research, I think.
Yeah, totally. Got to interact with the bay we love. So I'd really like to spend more time talking with all of you instead of like talking at a screen. So Will, can I turn it back over to you to give us some questions?
Thank you, Ivy and Mike, and please continue to put questions in the chat. We probably won't get to all of them, but we're going to try to get to as many as we can. Mike, one of the very early questions, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what would you comment on the effects to the bay, if any, between a wet summer punctuated by several heat waves? You know, I think getting at the that's one way our climate is changing, rather than these smaller storms every so often. We're having these long periods of drought punctuated by really large storms.
By the more extreme storms. Yeah, I'm not sure yet. We worry about more runoff, first off, bringing more nutrients from land. But we were also wondering if, because it was so dry in between those storms, that a lot of that rainwater just got soaked up. Something we're interested in looking into, not quite sure yet, but we'll continue to monitor the bay and see if we can make any correlations back to that.
Yeah, I saw a comment earlier when Will asked the question in the beginning about how lawns appeared to be saturated all summer, and it was from a colleague of ours who lives in Friendship, Maine, and I wondered if he was looking at something that happened there where there was more rain versus here, because it seemed like when we were out in the field that the ground was absorbing the moisture more all summer. Like it wasn't as saturated until, you know, until further in the summer. Like there was so much drought going into the summer that the ground was actually absorbing more moisture than going into the bay. What do you think, Mike?
I think, yeah, I hate to, it's kind of a cop out, but we kind of need more summers like this and more data collection to kind of make those connections, I think. But yeah, it definitely felt like we didn't see the kind of runoff I would have expected from such a wet July. But again, that's just kind of observational. But we'll keep collecting data. Unfortunately, I think we're going to see more conditions like we saw this summer. So we'll have the opportunity to collect more data and see what it's telling us.
On the data side, Mike, a couple questions around salinity. Do you see a difference in salinity and rainfall between our continuous monitoring stations, the Yarmouth and the Harpswell, the Yarmouth and Portland station versus Harpswell?
Yes.
Between the three, like what's the differences that you see? And and then as you think about that, a number of people noticed the huge downward spike in April-ish 2019. And I think it was when you were looking at the salinity graph. You might want to pull it back up, but you tell folks what happened then during that.
I think you answered that, right, Mike? But maybe
I think so. Yeah, that was the big, one of the biggest snowmelt events we've seen. Biggest river flow. Looking at USGS river gauge data, river flow during that time, that dip in salinity was extremely high. Because at first I thought that salinity data might be compromised in some way, needed to be flagged, but it was a very real event and was traced back to that spring freshet, the big river flow after a very big snowmelt. So that was the 2019 data. Certainly locally, rain events absolutely have a big impact on different areas, and we could certainly see evidence of river flow impacting Kennebec River flow and our Harpswell station over in the mouth of the New Meadows. Off and on, this is kind of the first summer we have this data to look at. So I'm still excited to have a little bit of downtime, after the seasonal sampling has ended, to really dig into the data. But you can see events where the salinity shows how Harpswell might be different from, say, Portland Harbor because of the Kennebec. Other times the Royal River might influence that Yarmouth station a bit more. But yes, there are differences between the sites, and we're starting to tease that out now.
It seemed to me, I can't remember whether it was last year or the year before, Mike, that where definitely usually when there's big rain events, we've seen in prior years bigger dips in salinity when we're out with the sonde.
Yep.
And this year that didn't really seem to happen the same way. It seemed like things just remained saltier. Like we
Yeah.
hardly ever dip below that 30 parts per thousand, and we sort of seem to stay higher. I have no
Right.
idea why, but
No,
whether it was the snowpack or whatever, but
right.
would you
Yeah,
agree?
I agree that definitely less snow this past winter had an impact, but yeah, it was unusual that we'd go out after a big rain event expecting to see lower salinities or murkier water. And it just wasn't the case for whatever reason.
So one of the things, and before I turn it back over to you, Will, is this is, we've had one continuous monitoring station, as Mike was saying, we're like in our 6th season, and then we have 2 newer stations, and we're learning in real time. I mean, there's so much that we didn't have continuous monitoring before, the ability to use the same equipment in our seasonal monitoring as we're using in our continuous monitoring. And so there's a lot that we're noticing and that we don't have the answers to, but we're asking the questions and we're evolving our advocacy to try to keep pace with what we're learning. So back over to you, Will.
Yeah, and a lot of people were reflected on how clear the water was this summer, and you talked about that, but Mike and Ivy. And can you talk more about what you think just a little bit more on what might be accounting for the water clarity, how clear it is, and how clear it's been, and is there a connection between eelgrass and clarity, or filter feeding shellfish, wild or farmed aquaculture, and water clarity, or something else, or all combined?
We certainly saw less phytoplankton blooms through our seasonal data. And I'm wondering if that might have had something to do with it. Fewer phytoplankton blooms would be would lead to clearer water. Boy, I don't know about the aquaculture pulling particles out of the water or any of the other options, but yeah, I really just starting to look at the data from this past season, so we'll dig into it and see what we can find. But along with the increased water clarity, we did see reduced chlorophyll, so suggesting less phytoplankton in the water. That's really what I have from looking at the data so far.
And then Ivy, this probably up your alley. Question about the big project that's happening off of 295 on Back Cove. Many of us driving by see that. What is it? I know some people know that has to do with stormwater and combined sewer overflow. But can you talk about that and how that's will impact the bay?
Sure. So there's a series of 3 sets of, in simple terms, sort of like holding tanks around Back Cove. And they are designed to hold that first flush of stormwater, especially from the combined pipes that had sewage water and stormwater flowing in them. It will hold it in those tanks until the treatment plant has the capacity to take the water and process it. And what that does is, instead of having combined sewer overflows during big storm events go directly into the bay, carrying with it the most polluted storm water and raw sewage water, that the most polluted water will now be held and diverted to the treatment plant for treatment. What's really cool about the project at Back Cove that people are seeing is that, in addition to being part of the solution to help restore the health of Back Cove and Casco Bay, that project is being designed with climate change in mind. So they looked at projections of sea level rise and are designing the project and citing it so that it will do its job in the future, and there will be a park on top of it that will be still there with sea level rise. You won't be swimming or kayaking over it, we hope. Will, you're on mute.
Two science questions for you, Mike. First, the first one, you've used this a lot. What does low productivity mean? When you say low productivity, what are you talking about?
Boy, I'm just thinking about lack of phytoplankton, I guess. There's not a lot of algae in the water, so you don't have a lot of photosynthesis. In very brief terms, I'd probably tie that back to phytoplankton in the water.
You're talking about the base of the food chain.
Yes, sorry,
mean,
yes, yep, single-celled.
So, all right. So when you're not a lot of productivity, you mean not a lot of action happening at that base level of the food chain.
Yeah, yep, which we would see in water clarity monitoring.
Follow-up science question for you, Mike. The Gulf of Maine is reputed to be one of the fastest warming bodies of water in the world, and our data seems to confirm Casco Bay is warming. We've talked about that. How much of Casco Bay warming is due to being part of the Gulf of Maine? Or is the bay warming due to our river inputs or where it is in Maine? Can you talk about that?
Good question. All of the above. I'm not really sure. Absolutely what is happening in the greater Gulf of Maine, both temperature-wise and salinity-wise, certainly has an impact on what we're seeing here in the bay. We are part of that larger Gulf, but after that, we're still not sure, I guess is the best way of putting it. How much are the rivers getting warmer? We don't have a lot of river data, temperature data to compare to. That'd be a really interesting thing to look into. I'm sure it's out there. Are the rivers, is that river temperature data available, and is it warmer? And how might that impact our bay? Good question. Not sure.
Yeah, you talk a lot about how our work is sometimes following the mystery, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It seems like every year things get a little more cloudy almost. The more data we get, the more questions we have, but we'll keep collecting data.
I think I saw a lot of questions, and Will, I don't want to jump ahead, but it kind of relates into this about whether this low productivity we saw this year is good or bad, or what it means. And I think that's a really good question. I mean, we want the bay to be productive, right? Because it needs to support life, and it's always been a rich, productive system.
That's right.
But what this 1 year means, like this year is different than other years. So I don't know what this 1 year means or what to tie it to. And I, for those of you listening, like this is really like how we talk when we're in the field, and what causes us at the end of field season to come back and meet and work with our colleagues inside and outside of the organization. So you're asking about the influence of rivers. We just have started talking to our colleagues who monitor the Penobscot River and do work on the Royal, and we'll meet with everyone this winter to compare data and look at data gaps. Or we're working with another group on nitrogen criteria. And so we try to take what we're learning or the questions we have, and then work with people outside of field season to advance our understanding or put our data together and get a more comprehensive picture of what's going on.
Absolutely. Yeah, the data doesn't just sit here and sit on a shelf somewhere. We try to collect this data and then work with others who work in different fields, really, and see how this data fits into what they're seeing as well.
And use it in advocacy to get Clean Water Act permits tightened up and other things that you talked about. Along that line, someone asked, how well is Portland doing in terms of separating its stormwater and wastewater flows? How would you describe that, Ivy?
I think that in the last several years, Portland put together what's called an integrated plan, which is basically like taking all of its various permits, the ones that apply to the Portland Water District, the ones that apply to the city, and putting them together in one document, and looking at how to implement all their permit requirements in a way that makes sense for water quality. And in doing so, it also makes economic sense. And I think that since they did the integrated planning process, when we go, we attend meetings every quarter on the progress that they're making. And I think that the increase in the volume of work that they're doing and how they're doing the work has been really terrific.
Great. Getting a lot of questions around Portland Harbor, being that's the most populated region, and in some ways the most challenged. To what degree do you think that the dissolved oxygen is being driven by productivity as measured by the continuous monitoring stations? The Portland Harbor decline in dissolved oxygen doesn't seem to correspond with chlorophyll. Angie writes here. Do you have any comment on that? And
Sure.
it'd be really fun to observe the seasonal patterns in Portland Harbor as the station's active for a longer period.
Absolutely, that's the key at the end there. You need a little more data, or a lot more data, but at least another season of this to really kind of tease out what's going on there. I didn't know if there was a delay in the phytoplankton before seeing those low DOs, low pHs, or if it's less of a chlorophyll thing, more of an organic matter thing. There's more organic matter ending up, down near the sediments of the harbor, and that's what's driving higher respiration. We see higher PCO2 values there, as well as the low DO and the low pH. So it might just be respiration by organic matter decomposing, or it might be just sort of a delay between the chlorophyll, the phytoplankton, and what we're seeing. But we'll need more time and more data to really tease that out. But that's another great question. That's the kind of thing, we'll see that in the data, and then we'll start to talk about it and ask these same questions and see what we can learn along the way.
That question also prompts me, and I hope this isn't too collateral, I think it's related, is that right now, the way that we're collecting our data in Portland Harbor is we're doing a transect down basically the river channel of the harbor, and we're seeing the impacts of nitrogen loading and where the combined sewer overflows are and stormwater overflows are, or the urban impaired streams are, is right along the banks of the Fore River. And we're not collecting nitrogen data there, and we're not doing enough. Like, we did the nitrogen NAB, but I think that that's one of our data gaps that would be helpful to inform, like, what impact, like you were saying, is it dissolving in organic material that's impacting dissolved oxygen or whatever? But that's like a data gap that I think we've discussed and are thinking about.
Yep. And I think Carol asked, I think looking out on the video, we showed sampling from docks and marinas. And the question Carol has, Mike, is if we are taking water samples off docks, are we concerned about the boats in the area and their residual oil and gas floating on the water? Can you talk about what you've seen in terms of that? And does it
we don't
our data? And
right. I hopefully that would show up in what we're analyzing those samples for. And we certainly try to pick sites, off that dock that aren't, that don't have a sheen on top of it. But we really don't see that much where we go, oil sheens or any kind of obvious sources of pollution. So it hasn't been something we've been too concerned about.
The one site where we did see a sheen this year, we reported it to the marina right away, and they followed up. And so we do keep an eye out for it. And we did do a training for our water reporters on how to differentiate a sheen from an oil related product to other things that may look like sheens on the surface of the water. So we do look for that. But I think what you were saying, Mike, we are fortunate that we don't see it that much.
Yeah, most of the time we're not right in marinas with a lot of other boats. These are more piers where people might be launching a boat once in a while, but not that concentration of boats all at once. So
And you just talked about water reporters, and you've mentioned water reporters a few times. Dan has a question. Is there any place for citizen science in your data collection? This question I'll float out to you, Ivy.
Yeah, so our water reporters is a network. I think we're up to about 250 people right now who collect observational data around the bay. And that data is really critical because first off, spatially, there's so many nooks and crannies around the bay. We just can't get everywhere. And so much of the bay is privately owned. So we also can't get there for that reason. And different people around the bay have different access to areas. So that observational data is really important because it helps us track changes over time, and that can help us with seeing what we need to do in terms of pushing for certain regulatory reforms. And so that network is really, really important. And then and the other piece that we think about is whether or not there's a need to have any future events like the nitrogen nab we did a few years ago. It was in 2017 in Portland Harbor. If we need to look at collecting more nearshore data. So nothing like that planned yet, but we certainly very much continue to rely on our network of volunteers and hope to get out in the field. We did one field trip with our water reporters this summer, but hope to get out a whole lot more next year with our water reporters.
Mike, any plans to add a fourth continuous monitoring station located in the outer fringes of the Casco Bay to sample more open ocean conditions?
No plans currently. We're pretty happy with the three we have. We have sort of an open water station where we do the seasonal work that we can kind of compare those conditions back to the stations. But we feel very fortunate to have enough redundant equipment to get those three stations up and running. To get to a fourth station might be tricky. And we did try to keep all these stations kind of more near shore. We're really seeing impacts from land. And so we're using existing structures that we can get to by land and by sea. Adding a buoy station, something that we haven't really looked into yet. But,
and there are organizations that do the where they're offshore.
There are absolutely certainly offshore stations, larger buoys with more data we can compare to if need be. In fact, I do use the station down off New Hampshire off and on to compare readings with. And UMaine has a series of stations as well.
I think that's a really important point you just mentioned, Will, is that we do a lot for an organization the size of our organization, and the way that we amplify our work is by working within networks, so that, you know, although we might not personally be able to monitor green crab populations, we know the scientist who is, and we can compare data with her. We know the scientists at the Department of Marine Resources who are looking at harmful algal blooms. We can talk with them. We know the scientists at UMaine who can deploy offshore buoys and or at Bigelow or whatever. And so we really try to use our data in context and use the particularly this season, this time of year, to have those deep conversations and see how our science fits into the greater whole so we can best understand the bay.
Well, and we're getting towards the end here, so we'll just do a couple more questions and then I'll wrap things up. Ivy, you talked a little bit about this, but we had a question early on that the work that Friends of Casco Bay is doing in terms of data collection is world-class. What specific actions is Friends of Casco Bay doing to reduce pollution into the bay?
So one of the big things that we do through the Baykeeping program is comment on Clean Water Act permits. So either directly to reduce discharges from what's known as point sources. So like that would be like a sewage treatment plant, or from stormwater. And we have made major strides there. For example, with the East End wastewater treatment plant facility in Portland, which is the largest discharger into Casco Bay, in their last permit cycle, we worked to make sure there was language in the permit that to reduce their nitrogen load to the best of their ability. It's called nitrogen optimization. And under that term, in the last 4 years, they've removed 1.5 million pounds of nitrogen from entering Casco Bay. And on the municipal stormwater permit, we have advanced significant terms there to include water quality monitoring at all stormwater outfalls, requirements to make sure that all development and redevelopment uses techniques so that to the best possible ability, the site's hydrology or how it absorbs water remains the same as it was pre-development, and to require that urban impaired streams or those streams that aren't meeting their water quality standards that feed into the bay are restored to health. So the Clean Water Act permits is a big part of it. We also play a very active role on the Maine Climate Council and helping to shape a statewide collaborative network of public and private interests for monitoring and continuing to understand the changes to Casco Bay, and then to make the regulatory changes that need to be made based on that data. So we were instrumental in helping to get a bill passed last session to that effect. And I am helping to work with the that process should begin next year, and we're doing whatever we can to support that. So there's a whole lot more we're doing, and we were just talking about maybe doing a whole program just on all the policy work that gets implemented from this. And if you all are interested in that, we will certainly try to plan that for a future Casco Bay Matters. But I want to be sensitive to time and turn it back over to you, Will.
Sure, thank you. And then final question, and I'll wrap things up. And Mike, can you share how this the data that we collect and the data other entities collect, how do we share all of that? How do we get together and put that all to use with each other?
Then I'll let Ivy answer as well, but I think there's a number of ways we do this. Either like you said, just sitting down together and sharing data, sending files to someone else, just through requests for our data. There are a number of different ways, but we do make sure we're getting our data out there to whoever needs to use it.
I
And
think we
getting
also
data from
share
them.
it. I'm sorry. We also share it topic by topic. So like in the nitrogen arena, we're working with a group that's looking to develop the nitrogen thresholds for Greater Portland Harbor. On the ocean climate change or ocean acidification front, we're working with a different collaborative network and sharing data and putting everything in context. With the river groups, we're going to begin a process this winter of meeting with them and identifying data gaps or what's missing to look more at the watershed influences. So those are some pragmatic ways, topic by topic, that we work within networks. We also share our data through our webpage, and we're involved with the Casco Bay Shellfish Advisory Council, which is a collaborative group of really municipal shellfish managers and wild harvesters. And they are creating a data portal. We're involved with the creation of that, and our data will get shared through there. And we're also involved in efforts through the Maine Climate Council to create information exchange, if you will, that will be ultimately, if it all happens, will be sort of like a one-stop place to go for all climate related data. So there's like so many ways we share the data. There's so many ways it translates to policy that there isn't time. Like the examples I gave you are just a couple examples of the work that we're doing right now.
And just to add quickly, and of course, annually, the data goes to the DEP, the EPA, the
Yes.
Casco Bay Partnership as well on a regular basis. It's
Great.
not just topical.
Yeah, so it's actually a great ending question, because it's we try so hard to make sure the data is good enough that it can be shared and used in all these different forums and help us protect the bay.
Great. And we often say it takes a community to take care of the bay. So all of you joining us today, you are part of that community, helping us do this work to protect the health of the waters that we all love. So as we close, I just want to share 4 ways to make sure that you take part in our work. The first is volunteer your time, become a water reporter, or go on and check out our volunteer page of our website. and help us keep track of the health of the Bay. The second way to help is donate. We're a nonprofit organization. We're supported largely through the donations of community members like you. So please make sure you donate to support our work. Third way to help us out is get your voice heard. If you follow our work closely, Ivy will let us know when we need to make our voice heard so that good things happen either at the local level or the statewide level or federal level. And lastly, tell your friends and neighbors about our work. Please share the data that Mike and Ivy has been shared with you, and share with your neighbors and your friends and your family on how they can get involved in our work. Thank you for caring about the health of the Bay, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.